We are faced with a world where the sun disappears for months on end, and the cold becomes a tangible enemy, capable of killing faster than any axe. In the Viking Age, winter was not just a season, it was an annual apocalypse. Every settlement in the north knew that survival depended not on swords and ships, but on the ability to prepare for those very months of darkness, when snow blocked the roads and the wind howled as if it wanted to tear down the walls of the longhouse. A mistake in calculating supplies for just 1 week meant a painful death. A family could find itself trapped in ice, completely cut off from the world, unable to get even a handful of food. And yet, the ancient Northerners coped with this challenge for centuries. They had no refrigerators, preservatives, or supermarkets, but they created a storage system that rivals modern technology in efficiency, and sometimes surpasses it. Watch the video to the end to find out how ordinary cod became white gold that could be stored for years without a single gram of salt. What amazing secret allowed the Vikings to keep butter fresh all winter, and why their survival system is still considered one of the most ingenious in human history. What if I told you that the Vikings' main battle took place not on the battlefield, but in the dark barn of his own estate? Preparations for winter did not begin with the first snow, but at the moment when the spring sun first touched the earth. The entire life cycle of the Scandinavian was subject to a harsh calendar, where every warm day was worth its weight in gold. People understood that nature does not forgive laziness, and every hour lost in summer would result in hunger in winter. It was a constant race against time, in which all members of the community participated without exception. The psychology of Northerners was tempered by the expectation of long darkness, which covered the fjords with a heavy blanket. They viewed their supplies not as food, but as fuel for life, measuring them not by weight, but by days of survival. The fear of starvation, which they called the wolf at the door, was a powerful motivator for hard work. This fear drove them to seek methods of preservation that seemed impossible to other European peoples. Every grain, every piece of meat, every drop of milk had to undergo a process of preservation to prevent it from rotting. The climate of Scandinavia dictated its harsh conditions. High humidity and piercing winds could destroy crops in a matter of days. The Vikings learned to use these climatic disadvantages to their advantage, turning the cold wind into an ally. They observed nature for centuries, noting how food behaved in the cold, wind, or smoke. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, not in books, but through practical skills and strict rituals. One person's mistake in the harvesting process could cost the entire community its life. On the eve of winter, the farmstead resembled a restless beehive, where every movement was measured and meaningful. Men, women, and the elderly worked side by side, processing tons of fish, meat, and grain. The air was filled with the smells of smoke, salt, and sour whey, which clung to clothing and skin. No one asked why this was necessary, because the answer was obvious: to see the next spring. It was a time of utmost tension when the fate of the clan was being decided. Particular attention was paid to tools and storage containers, which were made with special skill. Barrels had to be perfectly airtight, and barns had to be protected from dampness and pests. Carpenters and coopers were valued as highly as the best warriors, because the preservation of supplies depended on their work. The wood for the barrels was carefully selected, soaked and burned so that it would not let air through. Every crack in the wall of the storeroom was filled with moss and clay with maniacal thoroughness. In this struggle for resources, there was no room for pity or sentimentality. If the year was a bad harvest, difficult decisions had to be made about how much livestock to slaughter. Keeping too many animals meant that they would not have enough feed and would die without being of any use. killing too many meant being left without milk and draft power in the spring. This balance of life and death hung in the balance every November. Interestingly, the very concept of wealth among the Vikings was often measured by the size of their winter supplies. A man whose barns were bursting with dried fish and smoked meat had real power and influence. He could throw feasts, support his druzhina, and help his neighbors in exchange for their loyalty. Food was a currency more reliable and valuable than silver or gold. Silver cannot satisfy hunger on a polar night, but dried meat gave strength to wield a sword. The winter months turned the estate into an isolated fortress, cut off from the outside world by snow. People gathered around the hearth, conserving heat and energy, and their lives depended entirely on what was in the pantries. Every meal was a reminder of summer and the labor that went into every bite of food. This formed a special, almost sacred attitude towards food that is difficult for modern people to understand. Throwing food away was considered not just wasteful, but a sin against life itself. The wisdom of the Vikings lay in the fact that they did not try to fight nature, but integrated themselves into its cycles. They accepted winter as inevitable and prepared for it with the cold calculation of professional warriors. Their survival was not a miracle, but the result of iron discipline and deep knowledge. This philosophy of active waiting and preparation shaped the unyielding northern character that became the stuff of legends. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about a life where every day depends on the quality of salted meat? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about the bloodiest but necessary event in the Viking calendar? October, which the Scandinavians called the month of Gourmet, or the month of slaughter, was a time of difficult but vital choices. The grass in the pastures withered, and it was impossible to keep large herds in stalls during the winter due to a lack of hay. Therefore, each owner had to cold-bloodedly assess his herd and decide who would survive the winter and who would become food. It was not an act of cruelty, but a strict mathematical calculation of resources. The entire slaughter process was organized with military precision so that not a single gram of valuable resources would be wasted. Meat, blood, entrails, hides, everything was put to use and processed immediately. Fresh blood was collected in vats for making blood sausage, which was rich in iron and nutrients. The animals' stomachs were cleaned and used as containers for storing food or as casings for sausages. It was a conveyor belt of death for the sake of life, working non-stop for days on end. Huge carcasses of cows, pigs, and sheep were cut up by experienced butchers right in the farmyards. It was important to cool the meat as quickly as possible, using the natural cold of the autumn air. The fat cut from the carcasses was melted down and stored in pots, becoming a valuable source of energy. This fat was used not only for food, but also for lighting homes during long, dark evenings. Special skill was required when processing meat for long-term storage, as any mistake could lead to the entire stock rotting. Some of the meat was immediately sent to huge vats with brine, if salt was available to the owner. Other pieces were rubbed with a mixture of herbs and berries with antiseptic properties, although this was a less reliable method. But the most common method was preparation for smoking and drying in the wind. At this time, women were busy processing offal, which spoiled the fastest. The liver, kidneys, and lungs were cooked first or turned into pate, covered with a layer of fat for airtightness. Animal heads were boiled for hours to obtain a rich jelly that solidified in the cold. Nothing was thrown away. Even bones were chopped up to extract the nutritious marrow or used to make glue. The animal skins were immediately cleaned of fat and meat, stretched on frames, and treated for tanning. They were used to make warm clothes, shoes, and blankets, without which it was impossible to survive the cold. The wool from sheep sheared before slaughter was washed, combed, and spun to make thread for winter weaving. Every part of the animal was turned into a tool for protection against the cold. This period was also a time of feasting, as fresh meat was abundant and could not be preserved in its entirety. The community gathered together to eat their fill before a long period of restrictions and salty food. It was a celebration of abundance on the brink of the abyss, a last burst of satiety before winter. People ate for the future, accumulating a layer of fat, just like the nature around them. The sounds and smells of the slaughter month carried far into the surrounding countryside, marking a turning point in the year. It was grim but necessary work, requiring physical strength and psychological resilience. The Vikings saw it as a sacrifice for the future, understanding their responsibility to their families. The ability to slaughter and butcher properly was valued no less than the ability to wield a battle axe. After the work was completed, the yard was thoroughly cleaned, and the barns were filled with rows of hanging carcasses and shelves with pots. Silence fell, and the master could look with satisfaction at the fruits of his labor, knowing that his family was provided for. This feeling of security was the main reward for the bloody work of October. But how exactly did the Vikings store these mountains of meat without refrigerators? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret of the architecture that saved lives. And what do you think? Could modern farmers cope with such a volume of manual processing in a couple of weeks? Want to know the secret of a building that was more important to the Vikings than the royal banquet hall? We are talking about the Bure, a special food storage facility that was the heart of the farm's economic life. This structure was designed with a single purpose in mind: to create the ideal conditions for preserving food in a harsh environment. The Vikings were not only sailors, but also ingenious engineers when it came to protecting their most precious treasure: food. The quality and quantity of their supplies determined whether a family would survive the long winter, especially in the north, where harvests were often meager and completely dependent on the weather. The main feature of the Bure was that it was often built on stilts or large stones raised above the ground. This solution allowed the room to be separated from the damp soil, which could retain moisture even in summer. The raised structure protected the supplies from sudden temperature changes that could occur in cold night fogs. This structure resembled modern storage facilities on supports, although the Vikings did everything based solely on experience and observation. Thanks to this, the product spoiled much more slowly than when stored on simple earthen floors. Another important effect of this design was protection from rodents, which always sought to get to the supplies. The smooth vertical posts made it almost impossible for mice or rats to climb them. Sometimes the Vikings additionally burned the surface of the posts to make them even more slippery and hard. This simple action increased the durability of the supports and made access more difficult for pests. In this way, they created a natural barrier that did not require constant maintenance. The walls of the warehouse were made of thick logs, tightly fitted together, but with a well-thought-out ventilation system. The Vikings understood perfectly well how important it was to remove excess moisture that formed inside the room. They observed how the wind moved across their lands and used this knowledge when placing small holes under the roof. Fresh air passed through the warehouse, but did not cool it down too much. This natural ventilation protected the supplies from mold, which could appear very quickly in the northern climate. Of course, ventilation was only part of this ingenious design. The walls were treated with resin or resin compounds to make them more resistant to moisture. The resin prevented microcracks from forming, through which cold and damp could penetrate. In some regions, birch bark was used, which was placed between the logs for additional insulation. This allowed food to be stored even during the spring thaw, when buildings often began to sweat. This approach showed how seriously Northerners took the protection of their supplies. Inside, the Bure was divided into zones, each of which was intended for a specific type of food. This distribution allowed different types of food to be kept in optimal conditions without spoiling. Meat and fish, which could be stored for months if properly prepared, were hung under the ceiling, where the air was drier. Large chests for grain were placed closer to the floor so that it would not get wet and clump together. Thanks to this arrangement, the Vikings could control the quality of their food and quickly find the necessary supplies when needed. Different types of provisions required special treatment, and the Vikings took this into account in every detail. Barrels of dairy products were placed on separate shelves because they needed a stable temperature. Vegetables and root crops could be stored in a darker part of the room where cold drafts rarely entered. Sometimes additional partitions were made inside the bureau to separate foods with different moisture levels. This arrangement prevented spoilage and extended the life of each dish, whether it was butter or dried meat. Particular attention was paid to the roof, as moisture could penetrate through it most quickly. It was covered with turf, birch bark, or wooden shingles, creating several layers that repelled water. The roof was sloped so that even heavy rain would not linger and form puddles. In regions with harsh winters, the roof had to withstand heavy snow loads, so it was reinforced from the inside. This sturdy construction ensured reliability even in extreme weather conditions. To protect the walls from slanting rain, the roof overhang was made especially wide. This solution prevented the logs from getting wet, which extended their service life by decades. The Vikings often checked the condition of the roof and replaced damaged areas long before the onset of cold weather. The roof of the bureau was monitored as carefully as the roof of a temple or the elders' chambers. After all, not only the safety of property depended on it, but also the very life of the family. The entrance to the warehouse was protected by a massive door with a reliable lock, the key to which was carried by the mistress of the house. It was a symbol of her authority and responsibility to the whole family. The woman distributed food, controlled the amount of supplies, and made sure that no one took more than they needed. This was especially important in winter, because every handful of grain could determine the outcome of their fate. Therefore, the lock was not treated as a simple protection, but as a symbol of order and discipline. Thus, the burr was not just a barn, but a complex technical structure, the pinnacle of Viking economic thought. It stood as a monument to human foresight, a silent guardian of the life of the clan. But even the perfect warehouse is useless if the food is not processed properly. Like this if you are impressed by the sophistication of this system.
This batch is cured well. It should last the winter.
Good. Seal the barrel when you finish.
Guess how long it took to create a piece of meat that could be stored for years without spoiling? The answer lies in the ancient art of smoking, which the Vikings perfected. The smokehouse was not just a place to prepare food, but a veritable chemical laboratory of the era. Here, in thick clouds of acrid smoke, perishable flesh was transformed into a long-lasting product. The smoking process was based on removing moisture and impregnating the meat with substances contained in the smoke. The Vikings knew that smoke from different types of wood had different effects and flavors. They preferred to use juniper, birch, or alder, which had strong antibacterial properties. Coniferous species with a large amount of resin were used less often, as they made the meat bitter. The meat was hung high under the roof of special smoking huts, or in the upper part of a longhouse. The pieces of carcass spent days and even weeks where the hottest and thickest smoke accumulated. Slow drying under the influence of heat transformed soft tissues into dense, tough matter. The smoke created a protective crust on the surface of the meat, impervious to bacteria and insects. The smoking temperature was strictly controlled by the master who monitored the hearth. Too much heat could cook the meat, making it unsuitable for long-term storage. too little smoke would not penetrate the thick pieces all the way to the bone. It was an art of balance that required constant attention and experience. Almost everything was smoked: pork legs, lamb ribs, sausages, fish, and even cheese. Each family had its own secrets for salting before smoking and choosing firewood. The taste of smoked foods could vary greatly from fjord to fjord, becoming a kind of calling card for the clan. These products were taken on long sea voyages as a reliable ration. Prolonged, cold smoking created a product that the Vikings called iron meat. It was so hard that it often had to be soaked or cooked for a long time before eating. On the other hand, such a piece could lie in a draka chest for 6 months and remain edible. It was the ideal preservation method for a people of travelers and warriors. The smoking process itself also disinfected the room, killing mold and parasites on the walls. The smoke permeated everything around, creating a sterile environment hostile to decay. The clothes of the people who worked in the smokehouse smelled so strongly of smoke that the smell became their second skin. But for the Vikings, the smell of smoke was the smell of safety and satiety. The Vikings also used smoke to preserve grain, slightly drying it before storing it in chests. This killed insect larvae and removed excess moisture, preventing sprouting or rotting. The technology was universal and applied to all types of organic matter. Smoke was the most accessible and cheapest preservative in the north. Interestingly, the hearth in the center of a dwelling also functioned as a passive smokehouse. Items hanging from the ceiling, tools and supplies were constantly smoked, which prolonged their life. Vikings lived in smoke from birth to death, and this was the key to their survival. But smoke was not the only way to preserve food. In the next chapter, you will learn how the icy wind turned fish into stone that could be chewed for years. How tasty do you think such food was compared to modern smoked sausage? For the Vikings, cod was not just a fish, but a strategic resource they called white gold. It provided people with food during the long, cold months and enabled them to trade with distant lands. Dried fish, or stockfish, became almost as much a symbol of the northern economy as ships and the sea. The Lofoten Islands played a particularly important role, where the combination of winds, humidity, and temperature was unique. Nature itself seemed to have created a huge natural factory that worked non-stop. Thanks to this, northerners were able to obtain a product that could withstand the harshest conditions. The secret lay in choosing the right time to fish. During the spawning season, huge schools of cod approached the coast, and fishermen could catch an incredible amount of fish in a short time. They were immediately cut up, with the heads and entrails removed, because it was the speed of processing that prevented spoilage. Sometimes the fish were left whole, only cut along the spine so that they would dry better. The lack of salt made this method particularly valuable, as salt was difficult to obtain in the north. This method allowed large quantities of the product to be prepared at almost no cost. The prepared fish was hung on wooden structures in the open air. These frames were placed in the most windy areas, where the sea brought moist but cold air. A temperature of around 0 degrees was ideal because the fish did not freeze, but it did not spoil either. The constant wind acted as a natural fan, gradually drawing moisture out of the fibers. This process was slow, but extremely reliable. No other drying method provided such durability. After a few weeks, the fish had already lost a noticeable amount of weight, but it took several months to reach final readiness. By this time, the cod had become so hard that it could be compared to dry wood. In this form, it became completely inaccessible to bacteria, and its nutritional value was preserved almost entirely. Even after prolonged storage in the barn, it did not change its taste and remained edible. Such a supply could be a real lifesaver in a bad harvest year. It provided the family with energy when fresh food was unavailable. The Vikings valued stockfish for its incredible durability. It could be transported over long distances without worrying that it would spoil on the way. The dry product took up little space and was light, so it was easy to take it to sea. During long expeditions, it became the main source of protein. This made stockfish the ideal companion for sailors. It was more reliable than most other types of food. To eat dried cod, it first had to be softened for a long time. First, the fish was beaten with wooden mallets to break down the tough fibers. Then it was soaked in water or sour milk until it became soft again. This could take several days, but the result was a rich and nutritious product. After soaking, the fish was used to prepare simple but hearty dishes. They were suitable for cold climates, where the body constantly needed energy. The Vikings ate stockfish with butter because the fish itself was almost fat-free. The butter provided the extra calories needed to keep the body warm. This was especially important in winter, when the frost could be very severe. The combination of dried fish and thick oil helped to maintain strength during hard work. This diet was simple, but very effective. It helped people endure the stresses they had to endure every day. Fish waste was not wasted either. The skin could be used as additional fuel when firewood was scarce. Sometimes it was fed to livestock in difficult times when there was not enough feed. Cod heads were dried separately and ground into flour, which was added to soups for thickness. This flour was a useful addition that improved the taste of dishes. The Vikings did not throw anything away. It was part of their culture of survival. The export of stockfish played a huge role in the development of the northern lands. The fish was sold to England, European countries, and even some areas of the Baltic. Trade expanded the influence of the Scandinavians and gave them access to necessary goods. High-quality stockfish could be exchanged for silver, fabrics, weapons, and grain. Thanks to this, many jarls and kings strengthened their power. Fish became the basis of wealth for entire regions. With the development of trade, stable sea routes appeared. They connected Lofoten with the major markets of Europe and made the Northerners important participants in international trade. Merchants sought to purchase northern dried cod because its quality was unmatched. Such trade relations strengthened political ties and helped the Vikings expand their influence. Fish brought not only wealth, but also respect. Thus, stockfish became part of diplomacy. Even today in Scandinavia, you can see the same fish racks as in ancient times. People continue to use a time-tested method that has remained almost unchanged. It is believed that it is the natural conditions that make the product so unique. Modern fish processors are simply repeating what their ancestors did centuries ago. This shows the incredible resilience of this tradition. It has become part of the cultural heritage of the North. Stockfish is still used in national cuisine today. It is used to prepare various dishes that have been passed down from generation to generation. Some recipes date back to the Viking era and have changed only slightly. This connection to the past makes the food not just an everyday product, but a part of history. People continue to preserve the memory of how their ancestors obtained and preserved food. That is why dried cod remains a symbol of northern cuisine. The drying process has long been an integral part of life on the northern coasts. In the spring, when the fish begin to dry, thousands of suspended carcasses appear on the shores. The sight is reminiscent of a scene that could have appeared 1,000 years ago. The wind, sea, and cold work the same way they did in the Viking era. People only control the process, but do not interfere with nature. This is what makes stockfish unique. Despite the simplicity of the method, its success requires a deep understanding of the climate. If the spring is too warm or too wet, some of the fish may spoil. Therefore, fishermen closely monitor the weather and adapt the process to its changes. Sometimes the position of the frames has to be changed to improve air circulation. This approach requires experience and observation. It makes the craft almost an art form. Storing stockfish was also an important part of the process. It was stored in dry barns, protected from moisture and rodents. Under such conditions, the fish could be stored for several years and remain edible. This allowed people to build up reserves in case of crop failures or difficult winters. Such reserves became a guarantee of stability for families and entire communities. They helped people survive hard times. But if fish was dried without salt, how were other foods handled? In the next chapter, you will learn the truth about salt. Are you ready to learn the truth about why salt was more valuable than silver to the Vikings? Unlike in southern countries, where salt could simply be collected on the shores of drying estuaries, in the north, its extraction was a titanic task. There was not enough sun for the seawater to evaporate naturally. Therefore, salt had to be boiled down, burning huge amounts of wood, which made it a luxury item. Due to the high cost of salt, the Vikings could not afford to simply cover meat with it, as was done in other regions. They used the wet salting method, or used seawater boiled down to a high concentration. The meat was immersed in brine, which penetrated the tissue, but this required airtight barrels. Every grain of salt was guarded like the apple of one's eye. Sometimes seaweed ash or certain sodium-rich plants were used to obtain salt. This black salt had a specific taste and color, but it served its purpose of preservation. It was mixed with charcoal, which also helped prevent the growth of bacteria. But the Vikings' main discovery was fermentation, the controlled fermentation of food. Instead of trying to kill bacteria with salt, they created an environment where beneficial lactic acid bacteria could multiply. Meat and fish were placed in barrels with whey left over from making cheese. Lactic acid reliably preserved the product, preventing it from rotting. Such food acquired a sharp, sour taste and a specific smell that could shock an unprepared person. But for the Vikings, it was the taste of security. Fermented shark, hakel, or pickled fish were delicacies available all year round. These products were also rich in vitamins that saved people from scurvy. The Vikings also used earth pits to store vegetables and some types of meat. The products were layered with straw and buried in cold ground, where a stable low temperature was maintained. The lack of oxygen slowed down the decomposition process. This was the prototype of the modern cellar. Pickling in vinegar was less common, as wine vinegar was an expensive imported commodity. Instead, very sour beer or fruit infusions were used. Wild apples, berries, and herbs were added to barrels of meat, creating a complex bouquet of flavors and preservatives. The lack of salt in large quantities shaped the unique flavor palette of Scandinavian cuisine. It was sour, smoked, dried, but rarely salty in the modern sense. This flavor was a taste of adaptation to harsh conditions. Salt only became widely available with the development of trade, but the old methods of preservation remained in the culture. They became part of the identity, reminding people of a time when survival required ingenuity. Do you think you could get used to sour meat for the sake of survival? Water is the source of life, but in winter it could become a source of death if it stagnated or became contaminated. It was difficult to store clean water for months, as it quickly went bad. Therefore, the Vikings turned grain and honey into drinks that did not spoil and provided a huge amount of energy: ale and mead. It was not just alcohol for fun, it was liquid calories necessary for survival. Brewing ale was a sacred duty of women, the mistresses of the house. The process itself was surrounded by rituals and omens because the health of the family depended on the quality of the drink. Barley grains were germinated, turned into malt, then dried and boiled to make wort. The addition of wild yeast and herbs started fermentation. Viking ale was thick, nutritious, and not very strong, so even children drank it. It contained B vitamins and amino acids, which were lacking in the winter diet. In essence, it was liquid porridge, bread in the form of a drink. A mug of such ale could replace a full meal. Mead was considered the drink of the gods and nobility, as honey was an expensive product. It was made stronger and sweeter by adding berries and spices. Honey was an excellent natural preservative, and mead could be stored for years, only getting better. It was drunk at feasts and on special occasions to lift the spirits. The drinks were stored in huge oak barrels in the coolest part of the house or in the cellar. The tightness of the barrels was carefully checked, because sour beer meant the loss of precious grain. Ale was a currency. It was used to pay fines, reward guests, and make offerings to the gods. In winter, when food supplies were running low, ale helped to maintain strength and warm people from the inside. Warm ale with spices was the best remedy for colds and melancholy. It stimulated the blood and gave a feeling of fullness, tricking the stomach. It is important to note that the Vikings knew the secret of eternal leaven. They kept a stick of yeast from the previous brew, passing it down from generation to generation. This magic stick started fermentation in the new wort. Losing it was a bad omen.
Keep the brew strong, my daughter.
The use of juniper and other herbs in brewing also acted as a preservative. Hops appeared later, but even without them, the Vikings knew how to brew drinks that would last all winter. It was biochemistry in the service of survival. Brewing was a way to preserve the energy of the grain harvest in a compact and durable form. Grain could be eaten by mice or destroyed by mold, but ale in a barrel was safely protected. It was a liquid battery for the long winter. Thus, a mug of ale in a Viking's hand is not a sign of drunkenness, but a symbol of victory over nature. It was a way to carry the solar energy of summer into the dark winter. Milk is a seasonal product. Cows were hardly milked in winter, conserving their strength. Therefore, all the summer milk had to be urgently processed into forms that could be stored for months. The Vikings could not pasteurize milk, but they discovered the power of lactic acid. The main products were skyer, a thick yogurt-like cheese, and butter. Butter was churned in huge quantities and salted heavily, if salt was available, or melted down. Salted butter could be stored in barrels for years without going rancid. It was added to all dishes, providing the necessary fat. It was said that a rich Viking ate so much butter that it ran down his beard. But the most interesting product was sera, sour whey left over after making skyer. This liquid was not poured out, but carefully collected in barrels and allowed to ferment. Sera turned into a powerful preservative, a sour solution in which meat and vegetables could be stored. Meat aged in sera became tender and acquired a special flavor. The acid killed putrefactive bacteria as effectively as salt, but was absolutely free. Barrels of meat marinated in whey stood in every self-respecting home. Cheeses were made hard and pressed to remove as much moisture as possible. The heads of cheese were covered with wax or oil-soaked cloth to protect them from mold. Well-aged cheese was as hard as a rock and was chopped with an axe or planed with a knife. Skyer was stored in open vats, where a protective crust formed on the surface. Inside, it remained fresh and sour throughout the winter. It was the main source of protein and calcium, especially for children and the elderly. Skyer was mixed with grain or eaten plain. The Vikings even used skyer as a drink, diluting it with water. It was excellent for quenching thirst and restoring strength. It was believed to cleanse the body and give vigor. The milk processing technology was waste-free. Every drop of the white liquid was turned into either food or a preservative. This allowed the summer abundance to be stretched out over the hungry winter months. Dairy products were the basis of the winter white diet. Without them, it would have been impossible to survive on fish and meat alone. It was a balance of fats and proteins found through experience. Sour whey was the Vikings' secret weapon against hunger. A simple liquid, often considered waste today, saved the lives of thousands of people. In winter, life on the farm was confined to a single room, the main hall with a hearth in the center. This is where people ate, slept, worked, and told stories. The hearth was the heart of the home, the only source of heat and the place where food was cooked. Saving firewood was as important as saving food, so the fire was kept moderate but constant. The Vikings' winter diet was very different from their summer diet. The staple foods were thick soups and stews, which were cooked in a huge cauldron over the fire. Everything went into the cauldron: pieces of dried fish, salted meat, grain, beans, and dried vegetables. Long cooking softened the tough foods and blended the flavors. There was a concept of eternal soup. The cauldron was never washed or emptied completely. Every day, new ingredients and water were added to it, keeping the mixture hot. This saved time and fuel, and the food was always ready to serve. The taste of such soup changed from day to day, becoming more and more intense. Bread was rarely baked, as it required a lot of firewood and a special oven. More often, flat cakes were made from barley or oat flour, which were baked on stones by the fire. These cakes were hard, and they were often broken and crumbled directly into the soup. Fresh, soft bread was a festive treat. The distribution of food was strict. The mistress of the house or the eldest man personally served the portions, ensuring fairness. Workers and soldiers received more, as they needed strength. The elderly and children ate less, but received the softest and most nutritious pieces.
Eat well. It will
Twice a
make you
day,
strong.
in the morning and in the evening, the family gathered around the cauldron. The midday snack usually consisted of a piece of dried fish or cheese, which was eaten on the go. Eating together was an important social ritual that strengthened bonds within the clan. The Vikings also ate porridge made with milk or water. Oatmeal or barley porridge with butter was a standard breakfast, providing energy for the whole day. Dried berries or nuts gathered in the fall were added to the porridge. The lack of fresh vitamins was compensated for with onions, garlic, and sauerkraut, if available. Pine needles or herbs were also brewed to make vitamin infusions. This helped fight disease and weakness. Life around the hearth was a school of survival. Young people learned not only crafts from their elders, but also the ability to be content with little and endure hardship. The warmth of the hearth and hot food were symbols of hope in the icy darkness. The winter diet was boring and monotonous, but it served its main function. It provided warmth and life. In the spring, when the first greenery appeared, people welcomed it as the greatest gift.
The audio is characterized by the sounds of a celebratory feast.
The hardest test of winter was the darkness, which weighed heavily on the psyche. To keep from going mad from the endless night, the Vikings needed light and celebration. The middle of winter, the time of the winter solstice, was marked by the great festival of Yule. It was not just a feast, but a magical act designed to turn the sun back toward summer. The most cherished reserves were opened for Yule. A special Yule boar was slaughtered, and the best barrels of beer and mead were saved. It was a time when thrift took a back seat. People had to eat their fill to show the gods and themselves that life goes on. The feast lasted several days, sometimes up to 2 weeks. All this time, a huge hearth burned, in which a massive Yule log was burned. The fire was supposed to dispel the evil spirits of darkness. People gathered in large groups, visited each other, and exchanged gifts. Fresh meat on the table in the middle of winter was a miracle. It symbolized victory over death and hunger. The blood of sacrificial animals was sprinkled on the walls of the house and the participants of the feast, blessing them for the coming year. It was an act of connection with the forces of life. Yule was a psychological release. After months of strict economy and hard work in the dark, the opportunity to relax, drink, and eat was vitally important. It gave people the strength to survive the second, most difficult half of winter, when supplies began to dwindle. During the festival, oaths were sworn on the sacred boar or the Jarl's ring. Men planned summer expeditions and negotiated alliances and marriages. Life looked to the future, despite the snow outside the walls. Yule traditions were steeped in the symbolism of the return of light. Round cakes symbolized the sun. Evergreen fir branches symbolized life that does not die in winter. The Vikings created their own world of light inside the longhouse. When the holiday ended, harsh everyday life and strict economy returned. But hope already glowed in people's hearts. They knew that the sun had turned towards summer and the worst was behind them. Yule was the culmination of the Vikings' survival system. It combined the material, food supplies, and the spiritual, faith and hope. Without this holiday, surviving the winter would have been much more difficult. The Vikings conquered winter not only with salted fish, but also with the strength of their spirit, their ability to enjoy life even in the heart of darkness.
We light this fire, just as our fathers did, remembering the deeds of those who came before us.
We have seen that Viking survival in winter was a complex system combining engineering, chemistry, biology, and strict discipline. They did not just stockpile food, they created a culture completely adapted to extreme conditions. From building ventilated barns to fermenting in whey, every decision was dictated by centuries of experience fighting death. Their white gold, stockfish, and smoking techniques allowed them not only to survive, but also to become the greatest travelers of their time.
May the Yuletide bring us strength.
Which Viking technology do you think was the most ingenious? Drying fish in the wind without salt, or marinating it in sour whey? Would you like to see a video about how the Vikings built their ships for long voyages? Write your ideas in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new dives into history.
Hail the return of the sun. May this coming year bring us bountiful harvests and the favor of the Aesir.